Chapter 20 is the third chapter set in the 18th century, which is the 1700s. And this chapter deals primarily with the way people actually lived in their daily life. Chapter 18 was intellectual and political, 19 was economic, and this is called the life of the people in the 18th century. And this is a real turning point century where certain things become quite modern, politically and economically and intellectually, and other things remain the same as they always have. And as you go through and listen to these stories of the way people actually lived, I want you to be thinking about how it compares to the way we live as 21st century Americans and the way your families are set up in education, medical care, marriage, children, all this kind of thing. So let's get right into it. Marriage and the family is section 1. So there's two different types of families out there in history and in the world today. You've got the extended family, which includes aunts, uncles, grandparents, nieces, nephews, the big clan. And throughout most of history, this was kind of the norm. Big families lived together, and when you grew up and got married, you moved in with your parents, and you just brought your life stayed right with theirs. This is particularly big in certain Asian cultures. But then the opposite of this is the nuclear family, where it's basically, look at our nuclear presidential family, where they are, it's mom, dad, and the kids. That's it. So there's a small, immediate family that's headed in one smaller household. And most widely practiced in Europe is the nuclear family. By 1700, this is kind of the way that it's headed, whereas in other parts of the world, the extended family continues to dominate and was dominating at that time. Most people in the 18th century got married pretty late in life, given the fact that they only lived until they were about 45 years old. They got married around the age of 27 was typical, so this is pretty late in life, given the fact that people did not go to college or have much education. So they were very much well into adulthood by the time they got married, and some people never got married at all. So why so late for the marriages? Primarily financial. People needed to really establish themselves with an income and land, particularly, before they could get married. They needed to wait, in some cases, for their father to die, for them to inherit the family farm. Or if they were a younger sibling or a younger brother, wait for maybe even their older brother to die before they had any kind of ability to make a living. When agriculture was still dominant, it really slows down life a little bit as you're waiting to get land or simply make money. Another thing is the dowry. Dowry are expensive. This is the price, the gift, the amount of money or whatever, the property that the bride's family has to give to the groom. Because the groom is taking over responsibility for that bride in this particular generation, and lots of histories like this. And so it's a way to sort of support the bride's family gives this gift to the groom and to help him get started to take care of their daughter, because she's going from the parents' family over to the man's family, and he's going to be taking care of her financially. So this is kind of the way you start off on the right way. This is a long tradition in history, the dowry. These are expensive. You got to save up for it. The only kind of modern dowry that I can think of is basically the bride's family typically pays for the wedding. So that's maybe our modern day dowry. All right. And also it was really hard to get married because you had to get permission from all kinds of different people, like the lords of your village, the local elders and landlords and nobility whose land you may have lived on, if you're a commoner at least, had to give approval to get married. And they often didn't give that permission if they didn't want to lose a worker or something like that. So it was very difficult to obtain control from your lord to get married. Plus, the lords actually tried to limit marriages to help control the population of poor people. This is sort of primitive and crude. They refused to let certain people that are lower classes get married because they didn't want more poor, peasant, unskilled workers. It was sort of a primitive effort at birth control. Sort of disturbing. All right, let's go on here. Work away from home. So, when people in the 18th century went off as young people, 15, 16 years old, to get their first work, if you're a boy, you wanted to get an apprenticeship, which was basically trying to work for a skilled craftsman and learn from him as an apprentice. You were typically paid very low, and that was your best shot to get into a guild. And of course, if you could get into a guild, you were probably set for life, where you would have really high wages and job security and all that. So apprenticeships would lead right into guilds. But that was hard to get into. Most boys were drifters, which means they were unemployed and they went from job to job. And maybe you'd be, work for a farmer for a little while, or maybe you'd, go work for someone else or move to a city. You just literally went job to job. And there's the picture of boys working in probably a little primitive guild house or something, making a fine product. For girls, most work opportunities for young girls were to be a domestic servant. You go into a richer person's home and you work as a servant in their household. You take care of their kids, you do their cooking and cleaning and laundry, and you're a maidservant. And a lot of times these girls were physically mistreated, primarily by the women that were their boss. They call it their mistress. They're the wealthy middle-class woman who employed and supervised them often was the source of physical abuse. They would, be physical, emotional, verbal abuse was all very common. And also sexual abuse. A lot of these girls ended up being exploited by the men of the house, the wealthier men. These are usually lower-class girls. And a lot of times it ended up in these girls leaving, getting out of these houses and moving right into prostitution, which is really a sad story. Section C is pregnancy, marriage, and community controls. So they get into the details of how and when people were having their babies and how that related to marriage and all of these things. So until 1750, here are some of the trends. It was not common to have illegitimate babies. So here's a little picture of an 18th century. We're going to talk about village life here and all that. So illegitimate child is a child born to an unmarried mother. So that's the definition of illegitimate, child born to an unmarried mother. You can call it bastard children. Illegitimate is also the same type of word. They mean the same thing. So it was not common until 1750, this was very rare. Most people that were born had parents that were married. However, many of the babies were conceived before marriage. So the data shows that up to 1/3 of the babies that were conceived in the 18th century, prior to the 18th century, were the parents were not married at that time. So there you have it. And so how do we deal with the fact that the illegitimacy rate was so low, but people were getting pregnant before marriage? They got married. They got pregnant, and then they got married. It was sort of an automatic thing, a shotgun wedding, you could call it. That was what the standard and custom was. And what made people get married who got pregnant? There were community controls that helped, and the community pressure, basically, from your people around you helped push people toward marriage that were pregnant at the time. So first of all, the parents. This is why they call it a shotgun wedding. The father comes with a shotgun, says, "You're going to get married now." Anxious village elders. No one wants to look like their village is up to anything improper. Indignant priests. Those are angry ministers who have been upset that you've committed a sin. Authoritative landlords are another source. And basically, if a woman got pregnant, these people came and applied social pressures so that she would get married to the guy that did it. And this was the typical way that it carries out. And for most of history, actually, this is still kind of the norm until 1750, then it changes. So what tactics did people use to police everyone's behavior and maintain these standards? Some very interesting public rituals involved when someone would do something that wasn't very acceptable in the society. There were several methods that the villagers would enact to get you to do what they wanted you to do. Here's a degrading example of a degrading public ritual. The young men of the village would typically gang up on the person they wanted to punish and force him or her to sit astride a donkey. Sit on a donkey facing backward and holding up the donkey's tail. They would parade the victim around the village, loudly proclaiming the offender's misdeeds with scorn and ridicule. The donkey ride and other similar colorful humiliations ranging from rotten vegetables splattered on your doorstep to obscene and insulting midnight serenades were common community punishments throughout much of Europe. Here's an example. When you did something bad, the people of the village would literally gather their pots and pans and come to your house in the middle of the night and sing and bang their pots and pans outside your window, wake you up and bother you until you did what they wanted. It was really harassment in some ways, but it was publicly acceptable for this thing to go down the way it did. And when you get married, sometimes they do this just to celebrate your wedding. They come and bother you on your wedding night. So there was lots of these sort of strange public rituals. They were in each other's business a lot. You getting that? If you lived in an 18th century village, I'm sure gossip and everybody's business was well known. All right, new patterns of marriage and illegitimacy after 1750. So from the century 1750 to 1850, there's an illegitimacy explosion, which means that lots of kids are born to unmarried parents. So it went from about 2%, as I said a minute ago, very low, up to 25% in most areas of Europe. That's 1 in 4. And then really it was up to even 36%, like a third of all children born out of wedlock, they call it, by 1840. So there's a huge boom in illegitimacy. Why? Basically, people started getting into romantic relationships at younger ages. Cottage industry provided an early opportunity for people to work, which means they didn't have to wait around for that farm. They got married at younger ages, or at least were in relationships at younger ages. They had sort of independent spirit. They had a little money in their pocket. They made some craft goods at home, and they started dating people, and then they would get pregnant. The second factor is that people moved to cities and towns quite often as the Industrial Revolution took hold in the late 1700s. And once you're in a city and town, you're very independent, away from parents. Your life is very urban, and you're away from these anxious village elders and all their strange punishments, and people just got together. Also, romantic relationships are becoming more common and replacing economic marriages and economic relationships. So now, beginning around 1750, people actually started getting married and falling in love because they were actually in love, and not because that guy had a bigger farm. So romantic relationships are actually the new norm, beginning in the industrial era. And so, when people are actually in love, they tend to have babies sometimes. But the difference is they weren't getting married. The new trend is that pregnancies would occur without getting married, and many men just were skipping out, and they wouldn't marry the women that they had gotten pregnant. So that's sort of somewhat sounds a little bit modern in some ways. So prior to 1750, people typically got married. After 1750, not so much. Section 2, children and education. So this is relatable. So for most of, at this point around 1750, they have the demographic data on the number of children born per woman, and it's 6. There were, on average, a woman in Europe had 6 children in her life. And they typically started later in life, even at the age of 30 sometimes. People were having their first child because, again, marriages were pretty delayed for most of this time. So 6 kids, most of the children did not survive. The infant mortality rates were very high. Anywhere from about 1 out of 5 children wouldn't survive the first year. In the more rural and poor areas, out away from civilization, basically in Europe, you'd have the more infant mortality rates at 1 out of 3. So a third, 1 out of 3 kids didn't survive the first year. They would die from any kind of disease that was out there. So don't worry about this thing about schools. Let's skip that. So lots of kids, but a lot of them didn't make it. So section B, child care and nursing. What's going on with how people are actually raising their kids and from the time they're infants? Well, among the lower classes, it was actually very common for mothers to nurse their children. So that's breastfeeding. And this was very common. It was actually really healthy. That's the best. Most doctors continue to say that's the best way to feed children is naturally, and there was no stigma attached to it. But in particularly rough and poor areas, like in Russia, where the peasantry is just completely oppressed, the women were too busy having to work and make a living to survive. They couldn't stop and nurse their kids, so they would shove a dirty rag filled with some sort of sugar water in it into the baby's mouth, and assumed that that was going to take care of their child's nutrition needs from right after they were born. It would be no surprise then that more than half of the children died in Russia in their first year of life. Their infant mortality rate was higher, of course, because they weren't actually feeding their children anything but dirty sugar water in a rag. Really brutal. Among the upper classes, here's the difference. It was common for upper class women to hire a different woman to nurse their children on their behalf. It was improper, it was common and below you to actually nurse your own babies. So we call these wet nurses. These are the hired women that feed your baby from their body. Very common among the upper classes only. And it was a status symbol thing. It was kind of a manners thing. And we just, you don't want to be seen doing that in the upper class, very prim and proper and Victorian. And, it's beneath you to do all that stuff. So the sad thing is that these wet nurses were often abused by the families that hired them. This was actually pretty sad. And they would blame the wet nurse if anything bad ever happened to their kid. Kid gets sick, it's the nurse's fault. Kid dies, the nurse killed the child. The killing nurses did this. This is a nickname that people would get, sort of these, when wet nurses would, get a bad name, they called them killing nurses. They would accuse these women of being negligent and not feeding the child enough, and they became a source of scapegoating these wet nurses. And so that term killing nurses is a negative term that was applied to them, probably not accurately. And the rumors were that there were greedy wet nurses that would move from baby to baby, and they would, stop feeding one baby and kill it in order to go to the next person and get paid. So just constantly seeking more income and not actually feeding the child. So, very interesting situation. Most people today nurse their own kids, and this is actually normal and acceptable. And there's, you go to the mall, there's places for people to do that so they don't feel ashamed and all that. So pretty different actually from now to the past. Section C, foundlings and infanticide. This is sort of a sad section. Throughout most of history, even though 1/5, 1/3 of the children died in the first year of life, there were still too many mouths to feed. There were still too many kids for the peasant class to take care of, and they didn't have enough money or food to feed them. And so it was common for people to actually kill their own children, one way or another. That's what the word infanticide means, to basically let your children either kill them or just let them die by not feeding them. Some people would literally lay on top of their kids in their bed and claim it was an accident because they just didn't have enough money or food to put in their mouth. And this especially happened to girl babies because at that time they weren't thought of as valuable for labor as boy babies. So it was particularly sad. So the Catholic Church, one of its great things it did, to its credit, even though it was very corrupt in other areas, they denounced and came against this practice of infanticide and people, sort of uneducated, poor people, just eliminating their own children. And instead, the Catholic Church urged and helped create, and they urged wealthy people, patrons and donors, to start foundling homes. Foundling homes are another way of saying an orphanage. And foundling homes, were built all over Europe. In Paris, there was a famous one built by St. Vincent de Paul, who was a very wealthy Christian man who decided that this was his calling in life, was to basically take care of the unwanted children. And so there were a lot of kids ended up in these orphanages. This is one in London called the Foundling Hospital of London, in the picture here. So Christian charity is a big deal. Wealthy Christians saw it as their duty to protect the innocent and the small children of Europe. And so they created these all over the place. You think back in the Renaissance, we looked at this maybe a little bit. I think it was in the Medici video. Brunelleschi built the first orphanage in Florence, and he used classical architecture to do it. And that orphanage was sponsored by one of the guilds in the city of Florence. So even going back to 1450 or so, it was common for wealthy Christian or civic organizations or people to sponsor these things. So orphans were very common in Europe at this time. In St. Petersburg, Russia, the brand new city, there's 25,000 children in the orphanage in basically around 1750 or so. In Paris, one of the biggest cities in the world, A third of the children were in orphanages, were in foundling homes by the 1770s. One third of children were being given up for adoption, or not really adoption, put into an orphanage upon birth. And the survival rates in these places were terrible. Survival rate was at best 50%, at worst 10%, which means anywhere from half to 90% of the kids put into these houses were not going to live very long. So they're terrible. Diseases were everywhere, mistreatment. Eventually, the solution was the people that ran these things, the governments actually sort of ended up taking over in England. They would just take the kids from the orphanages and put them right into the factories of the Industrial Revolution. That's a little bit later on in history. They were a source of cheap labor because they have no parents and no one's looking out for them. So you can tell the attitudes towards children at this point is not particularly great, particularly among the rich. There was kind of an indifference that people had toward children as they were little, and because they were so often died, people didn't really want to get close to their children. They wanted them out of sight and out of mind, which is why they had wet nurses and people kind of take over for them, because if the child died, you didn't want to have all this emotional closeness to them. You can see by these pictures here that people were fairly stiff and rigid, and there wasn't a lot of love and emotion among families. When you're having 6 kids and some of them die, the frequency of death was really high. Why the indifference? Frequency of death. And so you want to have people were advised by philosophers and doctors to have an emotional distance with their children because they might not make it. So this famous example of that is a historian, an English historian whose name was Edward Gibbon. He wrote actually lots of books, and one of his children wrote a book on the decline of the Roman Empire, the first guy to ever do that. Anyway, this guy was living in the 18th century. He had 10 of his children die in infancy. So he had probably 12 or 14 kids total. 10 of them didn't make it past childhood, and because he knew that was going to happen, basically he named all of his sons Edward after himself. He named them all the same name in the hopes that one of them would live and carry his name on. And only one of his sons did, and that one went on to become an even more famous historian than his father. Doctors' attitudes towards children were pretty bad. They didn't know how to care for them. Pediatrics was not a specialty. They didn't exist. They didn't know how to handle children, so they didn't get care. So there was this vicious circle of being a child in Europe. Basically, you were neglected because you were likely to die, and you were likely to die because you were neglected. You see? Can you follow the circle? You're probably going to die, so your parents neglect you, and because you are neglected, you do die. So that's the vicious circle of 18th century child raising. And when the children did survive, the discipline that they looked forward to as older children was very strict. Europeans at this point highly believed in the phrase, spare the rod, spoil the child, which meant they believed in corporal punishment, spanking. And these two people here are Daniel Defoe, was a Christian minister, and Susanna Wesley was also a pastor's wife, and she's the mother of a very famous religious figure whose name is John Wesley. And they said, look, our job is to make the children obey their parent, and so we believe in spanking and corporal punishment. That's the way that the Bible says to do it. This is what they claimed. So there's critics of this. Beginning in the Enlightenment, people like Rousseau came along and said, we've got to love the children here. We've got to let them play and care for them more affectionately. There was this movement beginning in the Enlightenment to change all of these attitudes towards kids. And maybe one of the things that we have to change is we got to stop swaddling our children, which means you wrap them up in these tight little blankets to straighten them out. When they're first born, babies are all curled up just like they were inside you. And you want to straighten them out physically by wrapping them in these tight little blankets like a little baby burrito. And they said, let the kids move around. Let them have movement and don't be so uptight. So some progress was made by about 1800 here, kind of a new humanitarian effort towards children. Section E, schools and popular literature. So we've got kids. Some of them survive, some of them don't. And the ones that do start being educated a little bit. So remember that in the Reformation, the Jesuits founded schools. This was their big thing, schools. and all over Europe, primarily for the upper classes. But eventually, this transforms into the governments of Europe, leading the way to create public schools or universal education. So universal education means we require all of our citizens to be educated, and the state's going to pay for it. Prussia, the Germans are the first. Underline that. That's important. They were the guys that were obsessed with the military and the tall soldiers. Remember. But they also were very modern in another way. They wanted all their kids educated. So by 1717, the year, the Prussians had established universal education for their society with compulsory attendance, which means you have to go. What's the motive? Several. They want good citizens, number one. Number two, religion. We want people. These are Protestant countries now. Prussia is Protestant. This was a big thing in Protestant countries so that everyone can read the Bible for themselves and be good Christian men and women able to interpret the Bible, understand it, apply it to their life, and not need someone to read it for them. This goes back even to Martin Luther, who wanted people to read the Bible in their own language. So really, there's now, and then secondly, there's kind of this competition now. There's the Counter-Reformation happening. Catholics are trying to recruit you and win you back through Jesuit missionaries and Baroque art. There's Protestants over here on the other side. And so some of the highest areas of literacy in Europe can be traced to areas where there was a lot of competition between Catholics and Protestants for people to be followers. So it sort of helped promote people reading and researching and making maybe mature, informed decisions about their religious faith. So it's definitely tied to literacy. So the result is that more people were reading and were literate in Europe. So let me give you some statistics. In 1600, the year, only 1 out of 6 French men could read. 1 out of 4 English men could read in the year 1600. These are estimates. 200 years later, in 1800, here's some data. 2/3 of French men could read. 1/2 of English men could read. And in Scotland, 9 out of every 10 men could read. So there's this huge boom in literacy over 200 years. And a lot of people say it's because of religion, as well as the government's trying to step in and finally educate people. All right, last bit. So what are all these people reading? Here, like this girl in the picture here. Well, they're not reading the Enlightenment, okay? The Enlightenment had very little impact on the lower classes or peasants. That high-level philosophy is only for the elite. So people primarily are reading things like the Bible. This is the #1 book of all time. And so everyone has a copy of the Bible, and that's the #1 thing they read. The other thing they read are things that are called chapbooks. These are little like miniature stories that have a moral message to it. And let's see what else. Oftentimes these chapbooks were about religious subjects. They featured Bible stories, prayers, devotions, and they'd have little stories about saints and famous Christians. It's like a little devotional, like a daily prayer book kind of thing, written in very common language for Christians everywhere, and it had like a little moral teaching to it. So primarily religious, but not entirely. It was somewhat like little educational moral stories. All right. Also, fairy tales. This is the age of the Grimm brothers in German states. So people start to read fantasy books, fairy tales, escapism, folklore, stories about witches and stories about Little Red Riding Hood and going to grandmother's house. And so think of some of these fairy tales that you've heard in your life or read that have turned into films, Disney movies, etc., like Snow White, Cinderella. These are all old German fairy tales that were written down at this time that had been circulating for centuries, but these Grimm brothers went around and traveled, and they went to these little villages, and they wrote down the stories that people had to tell. And this was very popular literature, so people love reading fantasy books today. This is still what people are into in literature and film today. And then the last example would be there was practical literature like almanacs, which has data about how to farm, how to plant, what the weather's like each year, like home repairs, guides. People are actually interested in practical stuff to make their little peasant lives better. So that's the first part of the chapter: marriage, family, children, schools, and education. And we'll come back next time and do food, medical practice, religion, and entertainment.